At a lavish gala, filled with 200 guests, a quiet black man in a simple suit stood near the edge of the room watching everything without a word. No one recognized him. Before the entire crowd, the chief executive of Novacor poured a glass of wine over his chest and laughed, treating him like a waiter who didn't belong, while his wife stood beside him smiling at the joke. What none of them knew was that this man owned the company about to sign a $1 billion deal with them that very night. If stories like this keep you hooked the way this one is about to, go ahead and hit subscribe before we dive in. It genuinely helps us keep telling stories like this one, and we'd love to have you along for the next one. The doors of the Meridian Grand Ballroom opened onto a river of light chandeliers, throwing gold across marble floors that had been polished until they looked like still water. 200 guests moved through the room in clusters of silk and tailored wool, their laughter rising and falling like a tide that never quite reached the shore. At the center of it all stood a banner announcing the night's purpose in careful script: the signing of the largest partnership in the history of Novacor Dynamics, a deal worth $1 billion, the kind of number that made people speak a little louder and stand a little straighter. Trevon Ashby arrived, without an entourage, without a driver announcing his name to a waiting crowd, without anything that might have told the room who he was. He wore a simple charcoal suit, the kind a man might wear to a modest dinner rather than a spectacle like this one, and the only thing on him that hinted at anything unusual was a small silver pin fastened to his lapel, the kind given quietly to a select group of investors earlier that year, easy to miss unless someone actually looked. He had learned long ago that watching told him more than being watched ever could, and tonight he intended to watch. Beside him, a step behind, and slightly to the left, walked Marcus Reed, his closest friend, and the only person in that entire ballroom who understood exactly what Trevon's presence meant. Marcus had worked alongside Trevon for nearly a decade long, before either of them had any reason to walk into a room like this one, and he carried that history the way some men carry a second heartbeat, steady and largely unnoticed until the moment it mattered. He glanced at Trevon now, reading the small stillness in his friend's face, and said nothing because nothing needed to be said yet. Near the entrance, a young attendant in a black vest looked up from his tablet and blocked Trevon's path with the easy confidence of someone who believed he already understood the shape of the room. He glanced at the suit, plain and unremarkable, and then at the dark skin beneath it, and some quiet calculation ran through his mind before he ever opened his mouth. He gestured toward a side corridor and said that staff entrances were around the back, that this door was reserved for guests only. Trevon looked at him for a moment, not with anger but with something closer to curiosity, and then simply said that he was exactly where he needed to be before walking past without waiting for a response. Marcus felt his jaw tighten at the exchange, a small heat rising in his chest that he had felt before in rooms just like this one. He knew Trevon well enough to know that his friend would not ask for the apology that was owed to him, would not correct a stranger's assumption just to soothe his own pride, and Marcus had come to understand that this restraint was not weakness but a kind of armor Trevon had built over many years. Still, watching it happen never got easier, and Marcus found himself scanning the room now with a sharper eye, already bracing for whatever came next. They moved deeper into the ballroom, past round tables dressed in white linen and centerpieces of white roses that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. A server passed with a tray of champagne, and near the bar, a cluster of guests in expensive suits laughed too loudly at something, the kind of laughter that exists mainly to be heard by others. Trevon accepted a glass of water from a passing tray and let his eyes move slowly across the room, cataloging faces, postures, the small tells that revealed who these people really were beneath the performance of the evening. It was near the edge of the dance floor that the first real collision happened. A tall man in a navy suit, moving quickly with a drink already half-finished, turned without looking and struck Trevon's shoulder hard enough to spill red wine down the front of his own jacket. Before Trevon could even react, the man let out a short, irritated laugh and told him to watch where he was standing, adding almost as an afterthought that this clearly wasn't the kind of party meant for someone like him. Several guests nearby chuckled along, more out of social reflex than any real amusement, and moved on as if nothing worth remembering had happened at all. Trevon simply nodded once, unbothered on the surface, and continued walking as though the moment had already dissolved behind him. Marcus, however, slowed his pace and looked back at the man in the navy suit for a long second, filing his face away the way he filed away every small cruelty he witnessed that night. He caught up to Trevon near one of the tall windows overlooking the city skyline and asked quietly if he wanted to leave before things went further. But Trevon shook his head and said that he wanted to see exactly what kind of people Novacor had built its house around before he decided anything. Across the room near a raised platform reserved for the evening's official program, Grant Kessler stood surrounded by board members and senior executives, his smile wide and practiced under the weight of everyone's attention. As the chief executive of Novacor, Grant had spent the last 2 quarters absorbing quiet pressure from his own board, watching growth numbers slide just enough to make people nervous, and this billion-dollar partnership represented more than a milestone to him. It represented the one deal large enough to silence every murmur about his leadership, the one signature that could buy him another 2 or 3 years of certainty in the corner office he had worked his entire career to reach. Beside him, his wife Peyton Kessler moved through the crowd with the practiced grace of someone who had learned every rule of this world late and enforced them twice as strictly as anyone born into it. She had grown up far from ballrooms like this one in a small town where nights like tonight existed only in magazines, and marrying into Grant's world had given her a life she guarded fiercely, sometimes without even realizing how tightly her fingers had closed around it. She smiled at every guest who approached her, complimented every dress, remembered every name, because for Peyton belonging here was not something she took for granted the way the others in the room seemed to. It was Peyton who first noticed Trevon standing quietly near the edge of the VIP section, a roped-off area reserved for the evening's most important guests and board members. She studied him for a moment, the plain suit, the water glass instead of champagne, the way he stood slightly apart from the crowd, and something in her read all of this as an absence of status rather than a deliberate choice. She approached him with a tight, polite smile and asked if he could take a bottle of wine over to table 3, adding that the guests there had been waiting a few minutes already. Trevon looked at her without any trace of offense, only a quiet stillness that seemed to unsettle her more than anger would have. He told her calmly that he was not staff, and that he was simply a guest enjoying the evening like everyone else in the room. Peyton's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but she recovered quickly, choosing to interpret his composure as defiance rather than fact, and she said with a slight edge, now creeping into her voice, that this section was reserved for people directly involved in tonight's business, not for wandering guests who had lost their way. Marcus, standing several feet away, caught the exchange and felt every muscle in his body tense at once. He had seen this pattern before, the way people like Peyton mistook Trevon's calm for confusion, his quiet for a kind of helplessness that gave them permission to speak to him however they pleased. He took a half step forward, ready to intervene, but Trevon caught his eye across the small distance and gave the faintest shake of his head. A silent instruction that told Marcus to hold his position and let the moment continue to unfold on its own. Word of the small disturbance reached Grant within minutes, carried by a board member who found the story more entertaining than concerning. Grant excused himself from his circle of executives with the easy charm of a man who enjoyed being seen solving problems, especially in front of an audience, and made his way toward the VIP section where Peyton now stood with her arms crossed. He asked her what was happening, and she explained with visible frustration that a man had wandered into the reserved area and refused to help when she asked, adding that he seemed to think he belonged there. Grant turned toward Trevon and studied him for a moment, the same quick calculation running behind his eyes that the attendant at the door had made earlier that evening. He saw the plain suit, the untouched champagne, the small pin on the lapel that meant nothing to him because he had never bothered to learn what it represented, and none of it matched the picture in his mind of the kind of man who deserved space in this room tonight. Rather than asking a single question that might have changed everything, Grant chose instead to lean into the moment, sensing an opportunity to entertain the small crowd that had begun to gather nearby, curious about the tension building in the air. He picked up a glass of red wine from a nearby tray, turning it slowly in his hand as though weighing a decision that had already been made the moment he touched the glass. With a theatrical flourish meant more for the onlookers than for Trevon himself, he said that if this man wanted to stand among people who actually belonged in this deal, maybe he needed a proper welcome first. Before anyone could react, Grant tipped the glass forward and poured the wine directly onto Trevon's chest, the dark red spreading quickly across the front of his shirt as laughter rippled through the small crowd that had gathered to watch. Peyton laughed along, more out of relief that her husband had taken control of the situation than out of any real cruelty in the moment, and several phones rose into the air, almost instantly capturing the scene from different angles. Marcus stood frozen for a heartbeat, every instinct in his body screaming at him to step forward, but he held himself in place, watching Trevon's face for any sign of how this was going to end. What he saw there was not anger, not humiliation, but something quieter and far more dangerous, a stillness that Marcus recognized as the exact moment before Trevon made an irreversible decision. Trevon looked down at the wine soaking into his shirt, then lifted his eyes slowly to meet Grant's, holding his gaze for a long moment without a single word passing between them. The laughter around them began to fade as people sensed something in the air shifting, though none of them yet understood what it was. Trevon reached up, adjusted his jacket with a calm, unhurried motion, and turned away from Grant and Peyton entirely, walking toward the exit with the same quiet steadiness he had carried since the moment he first stepped into the ballroom. Marcus followed close behind, catching up to him just as they reached the hallway leading out of the main room, away from the noise and the phones and the laughter that still lingered in the air behind them. He asked quietly if Trevon was certain about what he was about to do, because once this decision was made, there would be no undoing it, no version of the evening that ended with a handshake and a signed contract. Trevon pulled out his phone without slowing his pace, scrolling to his lawyer's number, and said simply that the choice had already been made, not by him, but by the two people standing back in that ballroom, who had just shown him exactly who they were. He lifted the phone to his ear as they stepped out into the cool night air, the sound of the gala fading behind the closing doors, and when the call connected, his voice was even and unshaken. He said only that the partnership with NovaCore Dynamics was to be terminated immediately, effective before midnight, and that his legal team should prepare the necessary notice to be sent to the board before morning. Behind him, through the tall windows of the ballroom, the party continued exactly as it had before, bright and loud, and entirely unaware that the night's true business had already been decided quietly in the dark by a man they had mistaken for no one at all. Inside the ballroom, the noise never stopped, though something in its rhythm had already begun to shift without anyone fully noticing. Grant returned to his circle of executives with the satisfied posture of a man who believed he had just handled a minor inconvenience, well accepting a few approving pats on the back from colleagues who had watched the wine spill across Trevon's shirt as though it were a punchline rather than a warning. Peyton drifted back into her conversations near the dessert table, laughing a little too brightly, still riding the small thrill of having in her mind restored order to a room that had briefly slipped out of her control. Neither of them noticed that the man they had just humiliated was already gone, nor did they think to ask where he had disappeared to once the small crowd around them dispersed. In their minds, the moment had ended the instant the laughter died down, filed away as nothing more than an odd little disturbance in an otherwise perfect evening. The deeper truth that they had just made an irreversible decision without knowing it remained completely invisible to them, hidden behind the same assumptions that had shaped the entire encounter from its very first second. This was the quiet cruelty of the room itself, built long before Trevon ever walked through its doors. 200 guests had spent the evening moving past him without a second glance, filtering every detail about him, his suit, his silence, his stillness, through a lens that had already decided what kind of man he must be. Even now, with him gone, none of them paused to wonder whether their conclusions had been wrong, because the room had trained them never to ask that question in the first place. Marcus stood near the back entrance for a while after Trevon left, watching the party continue through the tall glass doors, feeling a strange mixture of anger and disbelief settle into his chest. He had witnessed plenty of ignorance in his years working alongside Trevon, but there was something almost surreal about standing in a hallway still smelling faintly of spilled wine, while an entire room celebrated a deal that no longer existed. He finally turned and walked back out into the night air, deciding that whatever happened next, he wanted to be there when it did. Trevon, meanwhile, sat quietly in the back of his car as it pulled away from the Meridian Grand Ballroom, his phone resting on his knee, no longer needed for the moment. He watched the lights of the building shrink in the rearview mirror, feeling none of the satisfaction he might have expected from a moment like this, only a calm, settled certainty that he had made the only choice available to a man who refused to explain his worth to people who had never bothered to ask. He had learned, long before tonight, that dignity was not something to be argued for in a crowded room, only something to be carried quietly out of it. Back inside, the evening rolled forward exactly as planned, unaware that its foundation had already cracked. The program began on schedule, the lights dimming slightly as a projection screen came alive above the stage, ready to display the ceremonial signing that was meant to be the highlight of NovaCore's year. Grant took his position near the podium, adjusting his tie, glancing toward Peyton with the kind of confident smile reserved for moments men believe belong entirely to them. The screen flickered once, then twice, drawing a few confused murmurs from the crowd as the presentation failed to load correctly. A member of the event staff rushed toward the control booth, exchanging quiet, urgent words with the technicians seated there, both of their faces tightening as they stared at something on the monitor in front of them. Within moments, a message appeared briefly across the screen, before it went dark entirely. A short administrative notice, referencing the partnership's status that vanished before most of the room could fully read it. Grant's smile faltered as he glanced toward the booth, assuming a simple technical failure rather than anything more significant. He gestured for someone to fix it, quickly aware that 200 pairs of eyes were now watching him instead of the screen, waiting for an explanation he did not yet have. Beside him, one of NovaCore's senior board members, a sharp-eyed woman named Diane Whitfield, who had spent years quietly questioning Grant's decisions from the sidelines, pulled out her phone and began typing rapidly, her expression shifting from curiosity to something colder. Diane had never fully trusted Grant's leadership, watching for 2 years as growth numbers slipped, while his public confidence never seemed to waver in proportion to the company's actual performance. She had come tonight expecting to finally see the deal that might justify his position, and instead found herself staring at a phone screen filled with urgent messages from contacts inside the legal department, all pointing to the same unbelievable development. The partnership, the one worth $1 billion, the one this entire evening had been built around, was being formally withdrawn. She looked up at Grant, still standing near the podium with visible confusion written across his face, and felt something settle firmly into place in her mind. Whatever had happened earlier in that ballroom, whatever incident she had heard fragments of from other guests near the bar, had clearly triggered consequences far larger than anyone standing near that stage yet understood. She said nothing to Grant directly, choosing instead to watch the situation unfold, already calculating what this meant for the board's confidence in his leadership going forward. Word spread through the crowd in scattered whispers long before any formal announcement was made, guests turning to each other with confused questions about what exactly had gone wrong. Someone mentioned the strange incident near the VIP section earlier in the evening, the man who had been doused in wine, and slowly, reluctantly, a few pieces began sliding toward each other in people's minds. A woman near the bar recalled that the man had worn a small silver pin on his lapel, the same kind she had seen earlier that year at a private investors' dinner, though she had dismissed it as a mere accessory at the time. Another guest, a younger executive who worked in the finance division, felt a cold knot form in his stomach as he replayed the earlier scene in his memory, the calm way the man had looked at Grant, the complete absence of panic or humiliation on his face. He turned to a colleague beside him and asked quietly whether anyone actually knew who that man had been, and the silence that followed his question said more than any answer could have. Slowly, the room's collective understanding began to shift, uncertainty, replacing the earlier amusement that had followed the wine spilling across Trevon's shirt. Grant, still unaware of the depth of what was unfolding, pulled his phone from his pocket and stepped slightly away from the podium, scanning through a series of urgent messages from his legal team and senior staff. His stomach tightened as he read the first notice, confirming that the partnership had indeed been formally terminated, effective immediately, with a follow-up email already circulating among select board members and investors. He read the message twice, certain there had to be some mistake, some miscommunication that could be quickly corrected with a single phone call. Peyton noticed the color draining from her husband's face and moved quickly to his side, asking in a low voice what was happening, her earlier confidence evaporating as she took in his expression. Grant showed her the message without a word, watching her eyes move across the screen, watching the same disbelief settle over her that had already taken hold of him. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke, both trying to understand how an ordinary night, one they had spent months preparing for, could unravel so quickly and so completely. It was Diane who finally approached them, her voice calm but edged with something sharper than concern, asking directly whether either of them understood who the man near the VIP section had actually been. Grant admitted reluctantly that he did not know, that the man had simply seemed out of place, someone who did not belong among the guests gathered for tonight's signing. Diane studied him for a long moment before informing him in a voice loud enough for a few nearby guests to hear that the man he had humiliated in front of 200 people was the very partner whose signature they had all been waiting for tonight. The words landed like a physical blow, and Grant felt the floor seem to tilt slightly beneath him as the full scope of what had happened finally settled into place. Every laugh, every phone raised to capture the moment, every casual joke made at Trevon's expense over the course of the evening suddenly reassembled itself into something entirely different, something far more damaging than a minor disturbance at a party. Peyton's hand rose slowly to her mouth as the same realization crashed over her, the memory of her own voice ordering him to fetch wine for table 3 replaying itself with a new and horrifying clarity. Around them, the crowd had begun to piece together the same conclusion, phones now being passed between guests as the earlier video of the wine being poured resurfaced with fresh context attached. What had seemed like harmless entertainment only an hour earlier now carried the unmistakable weight of public humiliation directed at the very man responsible for the deal that defined Novacor's future. Conversations shifted from curiosity to something closer to horror. Guests glancing toward Grant and Peyton with expressions that had shifted from admiration to quiet, uneasy judgment. Diane stepped back slightly, watching the couple absorb the full weight of their mistake already turning over in her mind. How quickly this story would move beyond the walls of this ballroom. She had spent 2 years waiting for undeniable proof that Grant's leadership had become a liability to the company, and though she had never imagined it arriving in a form quite like this, she recognized immediately that what happened next would not stay contained to a single evening. She excused herself, calmly moving toward a quiet corner to make a call of her own, already assembling the outline of a conversation the board would need to have before the sun rose. Grant remained near the podium, his earlier confidence completely gone, staring out at a room that no longer looked at him the way it had less than an hour before. Peyton stood beside him, silent, her mind circling back again and again to the calm, unreadable expression on Trevon's face as he turned and walked away from them without a single word of protest. Neither of them yet understood how far the consequences of that quiet exit would reach, but for the first time all evening, both of them understood with absolute certainty that something irreversible had already been set into motion. The ballroom emptied slowly that night, guests drifting out in small clusters, their earlier excitement replaced by a subdued, uncertain energy that followed them all the way to the parking valets. Conversations that had once centered on the size of the deal now turned quietly toward what they had just witnessed, phones still glowing in hands as the video continued circulating among group chats and social feeds faster than anyone could contain it. By the time the last guests left the Meridian Grand Ballroom, the story had already begun its journey far beyond the walls that had briefly held it. Grant and Peyton remained behind long after the room had cleared, standing near the empty stage with the caterers dismantling tables around them, the silence between them heavier than any argument could have been. Neither spoke for a long while, both replaying the events of the evening in their own minds, searching for some point where a different choice might have changed the outcome. Grant finally broke the silence, saying quietly that they needed to reach Trevon directly to explain, to apologize, to find some way to undo what had happened before the news spread any further. Peyton nodded, though her expression carried little hope, the earlier confidence that had defined her all evening now replaced by something closer to quiet dread. She had spent years building a place for herself among people like the ones who had just watched her husband's career unravel in real time, and she understood perhaps more clearly than Grant did in that moment that this kind of story rarely stayed contained. She said only that they should go home, that nothing could be fixed tonight, and that facing this properly would require more than a rushed conversation in an empty ballroom. By the time they arrived home, the video had already crossed a threshold neither of them could have predicted. What began as a handful of shares among Gala attendees had multiplied overnight into hundreds of thousands of views, then millions as the footage moved from private accounts into larger news aggregators searching for stories about wealth, arrogance, and public humiliation. Commentary sections filled with outrage, viewers zooming in on Grant's confident smile as he poured the wine, on Peyton's laughter beside him, on the calm, unshaken expression on Trevon's face as he simply turned and walked away. Morning arrived without any relief. National news outlets picking up the story by sunrise, framing it not merely as a personal embarrassment, but as a damning symbol of a deeper problem inside Novacor's culture. Headlines referenced the wine, the ballroom, the 200 witnesses, and the staggering fact that the man humiliated had been the very partner behind the billion-dollar deal being celebrated that night. Analysts speculated openly about what this meant for the company's reputation, while investors who had spent months anticipating the partnership began quietly reconsidering their own positions. Inside Novacor's headquarters, the atmosphere shifted from confusion to something closer to controlled panic within hours. Phones rang constantly across every department, journalists requesting comment, investors requesting clarification, employees whispering in hallways about what this might mean for their jobs. The company's stock, which had been expected to rise on news of the partnership, instead opened sharply lower, sliding further as the morning wore on, and the story continued gathering momentum across every major outlet. By midday, Diane Whitfield had gathered enough support among fellow board members to call an emergency meeting, one she had been quietly preparing for long before last night's events gave her the opening she needed. She arrived early, seated at the head of the long conference table, watching the other members file in with expressions ranging from anger to genuine alarm. When Grant entered later than the others, he found the room colder than he expected. None of the easy warmth that had followed him into meetings for years now present among the familiar faces around the table. Diane opened the meeting without hesitation, laying out the timeline of the previous night, with clinical precision, careful to separate fact from speculation, as she described what the video showed and what the company's legal team had since confirmed. She reminded the board that this was not the first time concerns had been raised about leadership decisions at Novacor, though it was certainly the first time those concerns had exploded into a national headline within a single evening. Around the table, several members who had once defended Grant's leadership now sat quietly, unwilling to offer the same support they had given so freely in years past. Grant attempted to explain himself, insisting that the moment had been a misunderstanding that spiraled out of control, that he had not known who Trevon was, that anyone might have made the same mistake given how the man had presented himself. That evening, his words landed weakly in a room already saturated with headlines and falling stock prices, and he could see in the faces around him that explanations no longer carried the weight they once had. Diane responded simply, asking whether not knowing someone's identity had ever been a justification for humiliating them in the first place, and no one at the table offered an answer. The meeting stretched into the afternoon, board members debating the company's next steps, some calling for an immediate public apology, others pushing for a broader review of leadership given how quickly the crisis had escalated. Diane proposed carefully but firmly that a formal vote on Grant's position as chief executive be scheduled within the week, citing not only last night's events, but the pattern of declining confidence that had shadowed his tenure for the past 2 years. The motion did not pass immediately, but the fact that it had been raised at all told Grant everything he needed to know about how far his standing had fallen in a single night. Outside the boardroom, the crisis continued spreading in directions the company could no longer control. Strategic partners who had aligned themselves with Novacor in anticipation of the billion-dollar deal began quietly distancing themselves, issuing carefully worded statements that avoided direct criticism while making clear they were reevaluating their own involvement. Major investors who had once championed Grant's leadership stopped returning calls altogether, their silence saying more than any public statement could have. Peyton experienced her own version of the unraveling that day, watching as invitations to events she had spent years cultivating quietly disappeared from her calendar, replaced by polite, distant messages, citing scheduling conflicts that everyone understood to be something else entirely. The social circles she had worked so hard to enter, the ones that had defined her sense of belonging since marrying Grant, seemed to close around her overnight, leaving her standing outside doors that had once opened easily. She sat alone in her kitchen that evening, phone silent for the first time in years, finally beginning to understand the true scope of what had been lost. That night, long after the news cycle had moved through its first full wave of coverage, Grant sat in his study, staring at a muted television, replaying the same footage from the gala over and over across different channels. He thought about the moment he had lifted that glass of wine, the small thrill of performing confidence for a crowd he wanted to impress, and how easily that single choice had unraveled everything he had spent his career building. For the first time since the previous evening, he allowed himself to consider fully and without excuse exactly what he had done and to whom he had done it. Across the city, Trevon sat quietly in his own home, aware of the storm unfolding around Novacor, but choosing not to engage with any of it directly. Marcus had kept him updated throughout the day, relaying details of the board meeting, the falling stock price, the mounting pressure closing in around Grant and Peyton from every direction. Trevon listened without any visible satisfaction, his expression as calm as it had been the moment he walked out of the ballroom, because for him, this had never been about revenge, only about the simple, unavoidable consequence of who people chose to become when they believed no one important was watching. 3 days passed before Grant found the courage to do what he had been avoiding since the morning after the gala. The board had not yet reached a final decision on his position, but the silence surrounding him inside the company had grown heavier with each passing hour, phone calls going unanswered, meetings quietly rescheduled without his input, a slow and deliberate erosion of the authority he had once taken for granted. He understood, without anyone needing to say it directly, that his career now depended entirely on whether he could somehow repair what had been broken in that ballroom. He called Peyton into his study that evening and told her they needed to go see Trevon in person, that a phone call or a written apology would never carry enough weight to undo the damage they had caused. Peyton listened quietly, her earlier defensiveness long since replaced by a tired, sober understanding of how completely their lives had shifted in less than a week. She agreed without argument, recognizing that whatever pride had guided her actions at the gala had already cost her more than she ever imagined it could. They arrived at Trevon's home the following afternoon, a modest house set back from a quiet street, nothing about it suggesting the scale of the world Trevon moved through when he chose to. Marcus opened the door before they could knock, having been told to expect them, and studied both of their faces for a long moment before stepping aside to let them in. He led them through a simple hallway into a sitting room where Trevon waited, seated calmly near a window, his expression unreadable as they entered. Neither Grant nor Peyton spoke immediately, the weight of the room settling over them in a way neither had anticipated. Trevon gestured toward the seats across from him, his voice even and without any trace of the anger they had perhaps expected to face. He said simply that he had wondered how long it would take them to come and that he was glad they had finally decided to stop hiding behind lawyers and statements and speak with him directly. Peyton was the first to find her voice, her words coming slower than usual, stripped of the polish she had carried so effortlessly at the gala. She admitted that what she had said to him that night had been unforgivable, that she had looked at him and decided in an instant that he did not belong among people she considered important without ever pausing to ask herself why she believed that in the first place. She said she had spent the days since replaying the moment endlessly, ashamed not just of what she had said but of how easily the words had come to her. Grant followed, his voice heavier, carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who had lost more in a week than he had built in years. He said that he understood now how thoroughly he had misjudged the entire situation, not only about who Trevon was, but about what kind of man he himself had become somewhere along the way. He asked quietly whether there was any possibility of restoring the partnership, admitting that beyond the apology, he still hoped some part of the business relationship could be salvaged. Trevon listened to both of them without interruption, his expression calm but distant, the same stillness Marcus had recognized so many times before. When he finally spoke, his voice carried no anger, only a quiet clarity that seemed to settle over the room like something final. He told them that the deepest problem was never that they had not known who he was, but that they had never once considered that it mattered. That a person's worth should not depend on a title or a signature waiting to be placed on a contract. Peyton lowered her eyes at this, understanding the truth in what he said more fully than she wanted to admit, while Grant remained silent, absorbing the weight of a sentence that explained everything he had failed to see in himself. Trevon continued, saying that the partnership had already ended the moment the wine touched his shirt, not because of pride but because trust once shown to be so conditional could not simply be rebuilt with an apology delivered under pressure. He said the deal had never truly been about numbers for him, but about choosing who he wanted his company associated with, and that choice had already been made clear to him that night, long before any lawyer confirmed it in writing. Grant asked almost desperately whether there was anything at all they could do to change his mind, some gesture or commitment that might prove they had learned something real from what had happened. Trevon shook his head slowly, telling him that some doors once closed were meant to stay that way, not out of cruelty, but because reopening them would only teach the wrong lesson to everyone watching how this story ended. He said he had no interest in punishing them further, only in making sure the consequence remained exactly where it belonged. It was Peyton who asked the question that had been sitting quietly beneath the surface of the entire conversation, her voice unsteady as she finally gave it words. She asked whether Trevon would have walked away just as calmly that night if he had truly been nobody, if there had been no company, no billion-dollar deal, nothing waiting behind his name to give the moment consequences. Trevon considered the question for a long moment, his gaze drifting briefly toward the window before returning to her. He told her that he had in fact walked away from rooms exactly like that one long before he owned anything at all, back when he was young and unnoticed and far more vulnerable to the judgments strangers made about him without ever asking his name. The only difference now, he said, was that no one back then had bothered to record it because no one back then had any reason to believe it would ever matter. Peyton absorbed this in silence, understanding for the first time that Trevon's calm was not a performance built for tonight, but something he had carried with him for years, long before this moment gave it any wider audience. The three of them sat in a long stretch of quiet after that, none of them rushing to fill the space with more words. Marcus remained near the doorway, watching his friend closely, recognizing that Trevon had just revealed something he rarely shared with anyone outside their closest circle. When Trevon finally spoke again, it was only to say that he wished them well in whatever came next for the company and that their time together tonight had reached its natural end. Grant and Peyton rose slowly, understanding without needing to be told that nothing further would change the outcome they had come here hoping to reverse. They thanked Trevon for the conversation, their voices quiet and stripped of the confidence that had defined them just days earlier, and made their way to the door where Marcus waited to see them out. Neither of them spoke again until they reached the car, sitting in silence for a long moment before Grant finally started the engine and pulled away into the night. In the weeks that followed, Novacore's board moved forward with the vote Diane Whitfield had proposed, ultimately deciding to remove Grant from his position as chief executive, citing both the events at the gala and the broader pattern of concern that had shadowed his leadership for years. Grant accepted the decision without contest, aware that fighting it would only prolong a story the public had already decided how to remember. Peyton, for her part, found that the world she had worked so hard to enter had little patience for the version of her that story had left behind, and slowly, quietly, she began rebuilding a life far removed from the one she had once guarded so fiercely. Trevon returned to his work in the weeks after the incident, fading from public conversation, the way most headlines eventually do, replaced by newer stories and newer outrages. He never spoke publicly about what happened at the Meridian Grand Ballroom, never gave interviews, never used the moment to elevate his own name beyond what it already carried on its own. Marcus, walking beside him one evening, as they left another quiet meeting with another set of partners, asked whether he ever thought about that night, and Trevon answered simply that he thought about it exactly as much as it deserved, no more and no less. He said that the real lesson of that evening had nothing to do with wine or ballrooms or billion-dollar deals, but with the quiet decision every person makes again and again about how they choose to treat someone who cannot immediately prove their own importance. Some people, he said, would spend their entire lives making that decision poorly, mistaking silence for weakness and simplicity for insignificance, right up until the moment the truth arrived and made the cost of their assumptions impossible to ignore. And for those who never learned that lesson at all, he added, the world had a quiet way of teaching it eventually, whether they were ready for it or not. If this story reminded you to look a little closer at the people the world tells you to overlook, that's really the whole point of telling it. If you'd like more stories like this one, subscribe and stick around, because there's always another one worth hearing. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.